The Western Front was the main theatre of war during World War I. Following the outbreak of war in August 1914, the German army opened the Western Front by invading Luxembourg and Belgium, then gaining military control of important industrial regions in France. The tide of the advance was dramatically turned with the Battle of the Marne. Following the race to the sea, both sides dug in along a meandering line of fortified trenches, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier with France. This line remained essentially unchanged for most of the war. Between 1915 and 1917 there were several major offensives along this front. The attacks employed massive artillery bombardments and massed infantry advances. However, a combination of entrenchments, machine gun nests, barbed wire, and artillery repeatedly inflicted severe casualties on the attackers and counter-attacking defenders. As a result, no significant advances were made. Among the most costly of these offensives were the Battle of Verdun in 1916, with a combined 700,000 casualties, the Battle of the Somme, also in 1916, with more than 1 million casualties, and the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917, with roughly 600,000 casualties. In an effort to break the deadlock, this front saw the introduction of new military technology, including poison gas, aircraft and tanks. But it was only after the adoption of improved tactics that some degree of mobility was restored. The German Army's spring offensive of 1918 was made possible by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that marked the end of the conflict on the Eastern Front. Using the recently introduced infiltration tactics, the German armies advanced nearly 100 kilometers to the west, which marked the deepest advance by either side since 1914 and very nearly succeeded in forcing a breakthrough. In spite of the generally stagnant nature of this front, this theatre would prove decisive. The inexorable advance of the Allied armies during the second half of 1918 persuaded the German commanders that defeat was inevitable, and the government was forced to sue for conditions of an armistice. The terms of peace were agreed upon with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. 1914 German invasion of France and Belgium. At the outbreak of the First World War, the German army executed a modified version of the Schlieffen Plan, designed to quickly attack France through neutral Belgium before turning southwards to encircle the French army on the German border. Belgium's neutrality was guaranteed by Britain under the 1839 Treaty of London. This caused Britain to join the war at the expiration of its ultimatum at 11 p.m. GMT on the 4th of August. Our armies under German generals Alexander von Kluck and Karl von Bülow attacked Belgium on the 4th of August 1914. Luxembourg had been occupied without opposition on the 2nd of August. The first battle in Belgium was the Siege of Liège, which lasted from 5 to 16 August. Liège was well fortified and surprised the German army under von Bülow with its level of resistance. However, German heavy artillery was able to ruin the key forts within a few days. Following the fall of Liège, most of the Belgian army retreated to Antwerp and Namur, with the Belgian capital, Brussels, falling to the Germans on the 20th of August. Although the German army bypassed Antwerp, it remained a threat to the flank. Another siege followed at Namur, lasting from about 20 to 23 August. For their part, the French had 5 armies deployed on the borders. The pre-war French offensive plan, Plan 17, was intended to capture Alsace-Lorraine following the outbreak of hostilities. On the 7th of August, the 7th Corps attacked Alsace with its objectives being to capture Mulhouse and Colmar. The main offensive was launched on 14 August with 1st and 2nd Armies attacking toward Sarrebourg-Morhange in Lorraine. In keeping with the Schlieffen plan, the Germans withdrew slowly while inflicting severe losses upon the French. The French advanced the 3rd and 4th Armies toward the Saar River and attempted to capture Saarburg, attacking Brie and Neufchâteau, before being driven back. The French 7th Corps captured Mulhouse after a brief engagement on 7 August, but German reserve forces engaged them in the Battle of Mulhouse and forced a French retreat. The German army swept through Belgium, executing civilians and razing villages. The application of collective responsibility against a civilian population further galvanized the Allies, and newspapers condemned the German invasion and the army's violence against civilians and property, together called the Rape of Belgium. After marching through Belgium, Luxembourg and the Ardennes, the German army advanced, in the latter half of August, into northern France where they met both the French army under Joseph Joffre and the initial 6 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force, under Sir John French. A series of engagements known as the Battle of the Frontiers ensued. Key battles included the Battle of Charleroi and the Battle of Mons. In the former battle, the French Fifth Army was almost destroyed by the German Second and Third Armies, and the latter delayed the German advance by a day. A general Allied retreat followed, resulting in more clashes such as the Battle of Locato, the Siege of Maubeuge and the Battle of Saint-Quentin. The German army came within 70 kilometers of Paris, but at the First Battle of the Marne, French and British troops were able to force a German retreat by exploiting a gap which appeared between the First and Second Armies, ending the German advance into France. The German army retreated north of the Aisne River and dug in there, establishing the beginnings of a static western front that was to last for the next 3 years. Following this German setback, the opposing forces tried to outflank each other in the race for the sea, and quickly extended their trench systems from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier. The resulting German-occupied territory held 64% of France's pig iron production, 24% of its steel manufacturing and 40% of the total coal mining capacity, dealing a serious but not crippling setback to French industry. On the Entente side, the final lines were occupied by the armies of the Allied countries, with each nation defending a part of the front. For the coast in the north, the primary forces were from Belgium, the British Empire and France. Following the Battle of the Yser in October, the Belgian forces controlled a 35 kilometers length of Belgium's Flanders territory along the coast, known as the Yser front, along the Yser River and the Yperlé Canal, from New Uport to Bozinghay. Stationed to the south was the sector of the British Expeditionary Force. Here, from the 19th of October until the 22nd of November, the German forces made the final breakthrough attempt of 1914 during the First Battle of Ypres. Heavy casualties were suffered on both sides but no breakthrough occurred. After the battle, Erich von Falkenhayn reasoned that it was no longer possible for Germany to win the war, and on the 18th of November 1914 he called for a diplomatic solution, but Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff disagreed. By Christmas, the VIAF guarded a continual line from the Le Basset Canal to south of Saint-Éloi in the Somme Valley. The greater part of the front, south to the border with Switzerland, was manned by French forces. 1915 stalemate between the coast and the Vosges was a westward bulge in the trench line, named the Noyon salient for the captured French town at the maximum point of advance near Compiègne. Joffre's plan for 1915 was to attack this German salient on both flanks to cut it off. The British would form the northern attack force by pressing eastward in Artois, while the French attacked in Champagne. On the 10th of March, as part of what was intended as a larger offensive in the Artois region, the British Army attacked at Neuve-Chapelle in an effort to capture the Aubers Ridge. The assault was made by 4 divisions along a 3-kilometer front, preceded by concentrated bombardment lasting 35 minutes. The initial assault made rapid progress and the village was captured within 4 hours. The advance then slowed because of problems with logistics and communications. The Germans then brought up reserves and counter-attacked, forestalling the attempt to capture the ridge. Since the British had used about 1/3 of the supply of artillery shells, General Sir John French blamed the failure on the shortage of shells. Despite the success of the initial attack, gas warfare, all sides signed treaties which prohibited the use of chemical weapons in warfare before World War I. In spite of this, World War I saw large-scale chemical warfare. In 1914, there had been small-scale attempts by both the French and Germans to use of various air gases, which were not strictly prohibited by the early treaties but which were also largely ineffective. The first use of more lethal chemical weapons was against the British near Belgian town of Ypres. Despite the German plans to maintain the stalemate with the French and British, German commanders planned an offensive at Ypres, which the British had defended in November 1914. This second Battle of Ypres, April 1915, was intended to divert attention from offensives in the Eastern Front and disrupt Franco-British planning. After a 2-day bombardment, the Germans released 168 tons of chlorine gas onto the battlefield. Though primarily a powerful irritant, it can asphyxiate in high concentrations. A prolonged exposure. Being heavier than air, the gas crept across no man's land and drifted into the British trenches. The green-yellow clouds started killing some defenders and those in the rear fled in panic, creating an undefended 6-kilometer-wide gap in the Allied line. The Germans were unprepared for the level of the success and lacked sufficient reserves to exploit the opening. Canadian troops quickly arrived and drove back the German advance. The gas attack was repeated 2 days later and caused a 5-kilometer withdrawal of the Franco-British line, but the opportunity had been lost. The success of this attack would not be repeated, as the Allies countered by introducing gas masks and other countermeasures. An example of the success of these measures came a year later, on the 27th of April, at Harlach, 40 kilometers to the south of Ypres, where the 16th Division withstood several German gas attacks. The British retaliated, developing their own chlorine gas, and using it at the Battle of Loos in September 1915. Fickle winds and inexperience led to more British casualties from the gas than German. French, British, and German forces all escalated the use of gas attacks through the rest of the war, developing the more deadly phosgene gas in 1915. Then the infamous mustard gas in 1917, which could linger for days and could kill slowly and painfully. Countermeasures also improved, however, and the stalemate continued. Air warfare. Aeroplanes specifically modified for aerial combat were introduced in 1915, while planes had already been used in the war for scouting. On the 1st of April, the French pilot Roland Garros became the first to shoot down an enemy plane by using a machine gun that shot forward through the propeller blades. This was achieved by crudely reinforcing the blades. The bullets which hit them were deflected away. Several weeks later, Garros was forced to land behind German lines. His plane was captured and sent to Dutch engineer Anthony Fokker, who soon produced a significant improvement, the interrupter gear, in which the machine gun is synchronized with the propeller so it fires in the intervals when the blades of the propeller are out of the line of fire. This advance was quickly ushered into service in the Fokker E.I., the first single-seat fighter aircraft to combine a reasonable maximum speed with an effective armament. Max Immelmann scored the first confirmed kill in a 9-decker on the 1st of August. This started a back-and-forth arms race as both sides developed improved weapons, engines, airframes and materials, which continued until the end of the war. It also inaugurated the cult of the ace, the most famous being the Red Baron. Contrary to the myth, anti-aircraft fire claimed more kills than fighters. Continued Entente attacks. The final Entente offensive of the spring was fought at Artois, with the goal of trying to capture Vimy Ridge. The French 10th Army attacked on the 9th of May after a 6-day bombardment and advanced 5 kilometers. However, they retreated as they had come into sights of machine gun nests and the German reinforcements fired artillery at the attackers. By the 15th of May the advance had been stopped, although the fighting continued until the 18th of June. In May the German army captured a French document at Levallois describing a new system of defense. Rather than relying on a heavily fortified front line, the defense is arranged in a series of echelons. The front line would be a thinly manned series of outposts, reinforced by a series of strong points on a sheltered reserve. If a slope was available, troops were deployed along the rear side for protection. The defense became fully integrated with command of artillery at the divisional level. Members of the German High Command viewed this new scheme with some favor, and it later became the basis of an elastic defense in-depth doctrine against Entente attacks. During autumn of 1915, the Fokker scourge began to have an effect on the battlefront as Allied spotter planes were nearly driven from the skies. These reconnaissance planes were used to direct gunnery and photograph enemy fortifications, but now the Allies were nearly blinded by German fighters. However, the impact of German air superiority was diminished by the doctrinal reluctance to risk the pilots' capture by fighting over Allied held territory. In September 1915, the Entente Allies launched another offensive, with the French attacking at Champagne and the British at Loos. The French had spent the summer preparing for this action, with the British assuming control of more of the front to release French troops for the attack. The bombardment, which had been carefully targeted by means of aerial photography, began on the 22nd of September. The main French assault was launched on the 25th of September and at first made good progress. In spite of surviving wire entanglements and machine gun posts, rather than retreating, the Germans adopted a new defense in-depth scheme that consisted of a series of defensive zones and positions with a depth of up to 8.0 kilometers. On the 25th of September, the British began their assault at Loos, which was meant to supplement the larger Champagne attack. The attack was preceded by a 4-day artillery bombardment of 250,000 shells and a release of 5,100 cylinders of chlorine gas. The attack involved 2 corps in the main assault and 2 more corps performing diversionary attacks at Ypres. The British suffered heavy losses, especially due to machine gun fire, during the attack and made only limited gains before they ran out of shells. A renewal of the attack on the 13th of October fared little better. In December, British Field Marshal Sir John French was replaced by General Douglas Haig as commander of the British forces. 1916. Artillery duels and attrition. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, believed that a breakthrough might no longer be possible, and instead focused on forcing a French capitulation by inflicting massive casualties. His new goal was to lead France wide. As such, he adopted two new strategies. The first was the use of unrestricted submarine warfare to cut off Allied supplies arriving from overseas. The second would be targeted, high-casualty attacks against the French ground troops, to inflict the maximum possible casualties. He planned to attack a position from which the French could not retreat for reason of both strategic positions and national pride, and thus trap the French. The town of Verdun was chosen for this because it was an important stronghold, surrounded by a ring of forts that lay near the German lines, and because it guarded the direct route to Paris. The operation was codenamed Gericht, German for court, but meant place of execution. Falkenhayn limited the size of the front to 5 to 6 kilometers to concentrate the firepower and to prevent a breakthrough from a counteroffensive. He also kept tight control of the main reserve, feeding in just enough troops to keep the battle going. In preparation for their attack, the Germans had amassed a concentration of aircraft near the fortress. In the opening phase, they swept the airspace of enemy spotters, which allowed the accurate German artillery spotters and bombers to operate without interference. However, by May, the French countered by deploying escadrilles to chasse with superior Nieuport fighters. The tight airspace over Verdun turned into an aerial battlefield, and illustrated the value of tactical air superiority, as each side sought to dominate air reconnaissance. Battle of Verdun. The Battle of Verdun began on the 21st of February 1916 after a 9-day delay due to snow and blizzards. After a massive 8-hour artillery bombardment, the Germans did not expect much resistance as they slowly advanced on Verdun and its forts. However, heavy French resistance was encountered. The French lost control of Fort-d'Ormond. Nonetheless, French reinforcements halted the German advance by the 28th of February. The Germans turned the focus to Le Morton to the north, from which the French were successfully shelling them. After some of the most intense fighting of the campaign, the hill was taken by the Germans in late May. After a change in French command at Verdun from the defensive-minded Philippe Pétain to the offensive-minded Robert Nivelle, the French attempted to recapture Fort-d'Ormond on the 22nd of May, but were easily repulsed. The Germans captured Fort Vaux on the 7th of June and, with the aid of the Gastei Phosgene, came within 1 kilometer of the last ridge over Verdun before stopping on the 23rd of June. Over the summer, the French slowly advanced. With the development of the rolling barrage, the French recaptured Fort Vaux in November, and by December 1916, they had pushed the Germans back 2.1 kilometers from Fort-d'Ormond, in the process rotating 42 divisions through the battle. The Battle of Verdun, also known as the Mincing Machine of Verdun or Meuse Mill, became a symbol of French determination and self-sacrifice. Battle of the Somme. In the spring, Allied commanders had been concerned about the ability of the French army to withstand the enormous losses at Verdun. The original plans for an attack around the River Somme were modified to let the British make the main effort. This would serve to relieve pressure on the French, as well as the Russians, who had also suffered great losses. On the 1st of July, after a week of heavy rain, British divisions in Picardy launched an attack around the River Somme, supported by 5 French divisions on the right flank. The attack had been preceded by 7 days of heavy artillery bombardment. The experienced French forces were successful in advancing, but the British artillery cover had neither blasted away barbed wire, nor destroyed German trenches as effectively as was planned. They suffered the greatest number of casualties in a single day in the history of the British Army, about 57,000. Having assessed the air combat over Verdun, the Allies had new aircraft designed by Citroën engineer Andrew Syway for the attack in the Somme Valley. The Verdun lesson learnt, the Allies' tactical aim became the achievement of air superiority, and the German planes were, indeed, largely swept from the skies over the Somme. The success of the Allied air offensive caused a reorganization of the German air arm, and both sides began using large formations of aircraft rather than relying on individual combat. After regrouping, the battle continued throughout July and August, with some success for the British despite the reinforcement of the German lines. By August, General Haig had concluded that a breakthrough was unlikely, and instead switched tactics to a series of small unit actions. The effect was to straighten out the front line, which was thought necessarily in preparation for a massive artillery bombardment with a major push. The final phase of the Battle of the Somme saw the first use of the tank on the battlefield. The Allies prepared an attack that would involve 13 British and Imperial divisions and 4 French corps. The attack made early progress, advancing 3,200 to 4,100 meters in places, but the tanks had little effect due to the lack of numbers and mechanical unreliability. The final phase of the battle took place in October and early November, again producing limited gains with heavy loss of life. All told, the Somme battle had made penetrations of only 8 kilometers, and failed to reach the original objectives. The British had suffered about 420,000 casualties and the French around 200,000. It is estimated that the Germans lost 465,000. Although this figure is controversial, the Somme led directly to major new developments in infantry organization and tactics. Despite the terrible losses of the 1st of July, some divisions had managed to achieve their objectives with minimal casualties. In examining the reasons behind losses and achievements, the British and the colonial contingents reintroduced the concept of the infantry platoon, following in the footsteps of the French and German armies, who were already groping the way towards the use of small tactical units. At the time of the Somme, British senior commanders insisted that the company was the smallest unit of maneuver. Less than a year later, the section of 10 men would be so. Hindenburg Line. In August 1916, the German leadership along the Western Front had changed as Falkenhayn resigned and was replaced by Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. The new leaders soon recognized that the battles of Verdun and the Somme had depleted the offensive capabilities of the German army. They decided that the German army in the West would go over to the strategic defensive for most of 1917, while the Central Powers would attack elsewhere. During the Somme battle and through the winter months, the Germans created a prepared defensive position behind a section of the front that would be called the Hindenburg Line, using the defensive principles elaborated since the defensive battles of 1915, including the use of Eingriff divisions. This was intended to shorten the German front, freeing 10 divisions for other duties. This line of fortifications ran from Arras south to Saint-Quentin and shortened the front by about 50 kilometers.